Welcome to Personal Landscapes. I'm your host, Ryan Murdoch. You can find links for today's episode and other conversations on Books About Place at ryanmurdoch.com. When his doctor told him to walk or die, Peter Carpenter transformed a health crisis into a feat of urban archaeology. In wandering the streets where David Bowie honed his craft, Carpenter uncovered hidden dimensions and new connections to pivotal Bowie narratives, shining a light on the legendary artist's conscious and subconscious influences. His multi-layered book is a fascinating look at David Bowie's cultural significance and the poets, painters, artists, and musicians who shaped the spaces he inhabited. Peter Carpenter is the author of Bowieland, Walking in the Footsteps of David Bowie, and of several volumes of poetry. His work has appeared in Agenda, Critical Survey, The English Review, and other publications. We spoke about David Bowie's Berlin years, how the suburbs shaped his sound, and the shooting of the cover for Ziggy Stardust. One quick note before we jump in. Personal Landscapes relies on the support of listeners like you to keep going. If you want to keep it paywall-free and ad-free, please consider joining my members club. You'll support the show and get cool book lover bonuses for what it would cost to buy a fancy coffee once a month. Go to my personallandscapespodcast.com website, where you'll find exclusive content like reading lists from my guests, long-form articles, including my latest, What I Learned from Paul Theroux, regular videos by me, and more. And now, here's my conversation with Peter Carpenter on David Bowie. So the walks that you describe in the book were a necessity as well as an interesting set of urban explorations. So what prompted this desire to move?
As you say, this is sort of multi-stranded, and unbeknown to me, I had serious heart problems. Severe mitral regurgitation was the term for it, so a heart valve that wasn't working properly. And this became apparent in 2013. So I went in and had open heart surgery, and which is an interesting experience, I have to say. And I came to, and my Portuguese night nurse, she was very patient indeed. And she just, when I came to consciousness, she said, "Oh, you were repeating this phrase, feto de ferro," and she translated "made of iron." And it took me a while to realize that I had a bit of David Bowie deep in there. I thought she was referring to all the metal that was in me keeping me together, but it wasn't. It was Joe the Lion. So I thought that was interesting, and Bowie had just come back into my life in a way because of the "Where Are We Now" video that came out in January that year. So I hadn't been keen on Bowie for a few years, but he kind of came back in big time. And then 2 days after the operation, I had a physio who was fantastic, great fan of John Cooper Clarke, incidentally. And she took no nonsense at all. And I was clanking around. She said, "Right, get up, you've got to walk." And I said, "You must be kidding." And she said, "No, we're going to walk up and down these stairs, and then we're going to keep doing this. And if you want to stay on the planet, you've got to walk." So I took this to heart, which was a good thing. And I started walking, and I got home. I had 3 months off to recuperate because your chest is sort of stapled together and lots of things happen to you. But I kept walking, and I became a walking fanatic. And this was a very helpful thing for me because when it came to Bowie's death in 2016, I first of all, I hadn't realized how profoundly I was going to be moved by it. And then I was a big fan, but as with many big fans, I worked out that I didn't really know much about him. Here he was, my hero, who'd gone. Where was he from? And what had he been doing all this time? So I met up with various friends, writer friend Tiffany Murray, who's written a great book, incidentally, My Family and Other Rock Stars, which is about a studio in Wales where she meets Freddie Mercury, amongst others. And she said, "Well, why don't we write about Bowie?" So that was going to happen, but it didn't for various reasons, nothing wrong with her part in it. Another friend said, let's do a Bowie all-nighter and sort of just stay up and listen to music, but this didn't seem right. So what I did was to just start going to the places where I'd been reading about vigils. And the thing about Bowie, I suppose, in that way, for the walking, was that there was no one shrine. So fans had to adopt places. So whether that was Brixton and the mural, Jimmy C's mural in Brixton, or the Ritzy Cinema in Brixton, because he was born in Brixton, well, Stockwell, actually, to be honest. It doesn't sound so good though, does it? And Brixton boy, so he's adopted there. But also the obvious one was Heddon Street, the site for the photo shoot for the Ziggy album. So I went up there and I was astonished by what I found. I mean, hundreds of people, mounds of flowers, candles, and I bumped into somebody, which was one of the great things about the walking. And I suppose something to stress that the walks they developed through happenstance, through, I mean, compulsion, because I was walking fanatically, but also just bumping into people. So this chap, he had a time lapse camera and he was just taking pictures of the place where Bowie had posed for the Ziggy character in Heddon Street and all the people walking past. So I'm on there somewhere. And his name was well, I hope they've got rid of that. And his name was Mark Coker. And we got on. It's one of those things. I started chatting, we got on, and he was working on a film called Beside Bowie, which is the story of Mick Ronson, Bowie's great guitarist and, just a genius, I think. And so we were just talking about it. And he was talking about his journey and how he had worked that out, how he'd shaped this really, given his adoration of Bowie. And I thought, well, I'm onto something here, just going to these places. So maybe this is a starting point for what I'm going to do. And it was pretty easy to do some research on Bowie. I mean, everybody was writing about Bowie. There were books coming out all over the place. There were new series. But what most people hadn't done, it seemed to me, was actually to go to any of the places that mattered in Bowie's life. So you could search for Bowie online, but that meant nothing to me at all. And it was so rewarding. It was so amazing, actually, to go to these places that were reckoned in many of the books and to find out, well, what was it like in his little house, his parents' little house in Plaistow Grove near Sundridge Park Station, where he lived for so many years of his adolescence and into even up to and through into his early 20s before he was moving around. And it was just that. It was the resonance of places, I suppose, the layers and the connections. And in that way, I developed the book. So there was no sort of set plan. And I thought this was in keeping with what Bowie was about. I mean, Bowie's life was one of making himself up. I mean, he was an autodidact, as you know, of stupendous ability. This was somebody who left school with one art O level in July 1963 and who conquered the world. And he didn't stop moving. So I suppose those are some of the strands, that kind of compulsion. And another element is to do with the artistic heritage, I suppose, that I was part of, in that I'm a writer, I've been a teacher all my life, and writers like Wordsworth meant a great deal to me. And it seemed to me that Wordsworth's writings, those solitary trampings, they kind of chimed with what I was doing, and also with what Bowie did, just getting out there and bumping into people and mythologizing a place. Thomas Hardy's Wessex is a great example of that. You go to a real place and you turn it into something that's between fact and fiction. So for Wessex, you're always thinking in his novels, you're always thinking, well, what was it like? What was Dorchester like next to Casterbridge, etc. So those are some of the strands, I suppose.
You have a great quote in the book too. You said, "Places haunt people just as much as people haunt places." The,
Yeah.
the idea that they leave this resonance behind them in these locations is really interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. I genuinely believe that. And I believe it through my own experience, because who can fail to go back to a childhood house, for example, and not be moved by the resonance of what happened there? And it's the particularity of it. So, for example, on the walks, and one of the last walks is going to Tolworth, where Bowie played towards the start of his Ziggy tour. And it was a pub. He played in a pub called the Toby Jug, which is a pub I went to underage, it has to be said. But also it was next to the Charrington Bowl, which was a great sort of bowling. You should go bowling there. And there was a burger van. And I went up there with my friend Ian, who had a motorbike, a BSA 250, and he sort of hang out there. And I just couldn't believe that Bowie, that was where he really started off as Ziggy. So that was the everyday place. But on that trip, I went back to Epsom, where I was brought up. And I walked past my family home. And you just can't fail to be moved, because you bring yourself back to these places. And I think that was the essence of the walks that developed, that many of them were around places that I'd known when I was a lot younger, when I was a teenager growing up in that kind of strange penumbra of South London. So Epsom up into Tolworth, Kingston, but in particular Croydon, Wallington, all those places. And Beckenham and Bromley, I knew them quite well. So going back to these places, you sort of bring yourself back. And studios, I think, are a great example of that. To give you one example that isn't Bowie, I loved Dark Side of the Moon by Pink Floyd. And if you listen to that, Pink Floyd were brilliant, because they asked all these questions of the people in the building when they were recording it. And as you'll know, you get this extraordinary intro and this voice. I won't do the accent, but it's "I'm Not Afraid of Dying," that one. And that's Jerry O'Driscoll, who's the doorman at Abbey Road Studios. And so they literally get the imprint of a building. So I do really believe in that. And Kansas Studios, which you may get onto, I think that's a classic example of a building that inhabits the sound, and that going back to a place like that, even when it's been sanitized and cleaned beyond recognition, is intensely moving.
It's interesting too that these people seem to exist in another world. Like you see the persona, the arts, and these larger than life figures, and then to situate them in a normal context in a place that's it humanizes them in a way, in a sense, like they came from somewhere.
Yeah,
It's very disorienting to imagine. It's like when you meet, I don't know, if a musician or author or an actor or something, and you see them just in a normal setting, and it just looks,
yeah,
there's something dislocating about that.
yeah. That I think that's really at the heart of it. That they're ordinary. I mean, and many of the people I've spoken to about Bowie during the walks and subsequently, people who've met Bowie and kind of met him at clubs and parties, and he just turn up. They say, well, he was an ordinary bloke. And yet he was transformational. I think it's that element of him to take the ordinary and turn it into, turn and face the strange, but which is almost a quote from Shakespeare, from The Tempests, turning something into something rich and strange. That's what he does. And he just turns it slightly. And it's very interesting also to think of Bowie in that context as an actor, which is how he referred to himself. And I think he was always thinking of himself as an actor, always thinking in some ways of the world around him as the stage, and the things around him as props. And indeed, I think they've just discovered, with the V&A archive opening up, they've just discovered some of his last plans.
Yeah, I saw that. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, extraordinary. I mean, I'm not sure about the project, to be honest,
Mhm.
but they're for a theatrical production with an 18th century setting, and I think he worked away from theatre in public life to become a rock star, but he never lost it. And he learnt, he was wonderful at learning lessons about how to present himself on stage. I think one of his managers, Ken Pitt, was a pivotal influence there, in that Pitt saw him as somebody who could perform on stage way beyond becoming a kind of second-rate mod or wherever he was in the successive movements. He knew he had that. And a key thing that Pitt did when Bowie stayed with Pitt in Pitt's house in Manchester Street was to get him an equity card, to take him to the theatre, take him to see Brecht, which never left him. He saw a particular performance of Brecht using the kind of very stark lighting that he was going to use when he came back and did his station to station performances in the UK. So he was great at patching things to him. But working from the ordinary, and people have talked about, being funny about the fact they say, well, in the book you go to Bromley. Bromley's not everybody's cup of tea, or Croydon. Well, they're places that are. They fascinate me because they are ordinary. They're the places that people walk through without necessarily looking at, but studying. And I suppose that's one of the things that I was up to. I hope that that's not meant to sound as if I'm alone in that. There are lots of people who do it, but I think you're right. Ordinary Joe.
It's interesting that you mentioned all these things that he had access to, theater and all these
Yeah.
different experiences. So that access to London, like London was the thing, the place where all these things were happening. I mean, could Bowie have become Bowie if he lived in Ottawa or someplace like this where nothing happens?
I think that's a great question, and I don't think I can answer it. But in a way, I could answer it just turning it slightly. He had access to London, but he didn't. He broke the mold, and he was desperate to get out from where he was growing up. And so, if you do go to Bromley, and if you do go to Plaistow Grove, and go to his parents' house, and if you read about it as well, but I've walked around it, and the great thing there is he had Sundridge Park Station, but could take him straight into London. Not now. You have to change now. He could straight into Charing Cross, straight into the West End, straight into the music scene, and he was out there. I mean, as a kid, by the age of 15, he was going to Eel Pie Island, to the Crawdaddy Club. He was desperate to get out and be part of a scene and to witness a scene. And also, he had a great sort of an inspiration, and in a way, not necessarily a curse, but a kind of heaviness in his life with his half brother Terry, who was 10 years older than him, who introduced him to Jack Kerouac, and to the music, Little Richard, etc., etc. But then Bowie was the sort of kid who searched these things out, and Bromley High Street, Medhurst as it was then, Primark as it is now, interesting store, he'd go and seek out the music. So he got Charlie Mingus and James Brown, Little Richard, very early on. So getting back to your question and trying to answer it, I would suggest that the suburbs of London can be really isolating and desolate places. And they're actually, although they're commuter land and you can get up to London and come back, what Bowie did was to break the mold and to think, right, this is it. I've got to escape. I've got to get to London. I suppose Dylan would be the example I'd take of somebody who comes in from Duluth and sort of rocks up into in New York City and just turns up, and he knows he's got to make it, as much mythologized recently in that film version, The Complete Unknown. But that's what Bowie was. Bowie was a complete unknown, despite gigging away. And people think, oh, it happened really quickly with him. He was a star overnight. Well, he wasn't. He wasn't at all. I mean, 1966, he played over 100 gigs. He had all sorts of near misses, and it was only Space Oddity, which in itself was a kind of, he had the fluke thing of the moon landing to help him there, that made him. But I think that was in his character as well. He was fascinated by travel, and so it was just a strand. Reading it, when I started doing this, beginning to read things about Bowie, people have focused on the shape changing, the fact that he was always changing character, Major Tom and Halloween Jack from Diamond Dogs, etc. But people didn't really focus on the what I would call that kind of transitional sense of Bowie, that he was always moving from one place to another. I think until his later years in New York, when he was happy.
What was it like, his parents' house, the house that he grew up in?
Well, it was tiny, part of a little terrace, and one of the misconceptions concerning Bowie, many people said it to me, oh, he was quite well off. He was middle class, he was upper middle class. No, he wasn't. He wasn't at all. His dad worked for Dr. Bernardo's as a kind of a salesperson. And that's where he'd met Peggy, his mother. And the house is tiny. I mean, there's no bathroom. There's this sort of really narrow staircase going up to Bowie's back room. And he turned his back room, which again was really small, into a kind of den. And I suppose that's what people do. That's, you seek refuge in your room. And he did all these drawings, cave drawings, and it was a bit like that. He'd turn it into a little bit of a studio, but with no disrespect to his mother, I think there was a coldness there, and he sought warmth in relationships beyond the family home. But it is tiny, and the back looked out onto a pub. Sundridge Park is actually quite a way north of the centre of Bromley, and he went to school. His primary school was Burnt Ash, which was again a bit of a walk, as I discovered, north up towards a place called Downham, which it's in the name about what it's like. And God forgive me for saying that, but he didn't mind that. He wanted to get out the house, and he was a very clever bloke. He had lots of things in his way. He was ambidextrous at a time when he was forced to write with his right hand, because he was writing with his left hand. There was no special needs. There are signs in his writing and compositional methods that he was dyslexic, I think, as an educator. So he had lots of barriers, but he passed the 11 plus, and he chose to go to a new school that was known as Bromley Tech. Is now Ravenswood School, and it was a long way south, and so he loved that. I think he was getting away from being at home. So his home was really, really tiny. And again, I don't want to upset the people who live there; they're doing their best. But it is just part of a terrace in suburbia. It's not poverty, but it's not great. So it was very much kind of, what would you call, working class towards lower middle class. So it's a really, really inhibiting space.
So where did he go first when he finally broke away and moved out onto his own?
Well, he has a succession of places to go to, but the major move was to go to Manchester Street, which is ideally placed for him because it's in the West End. It's actually just down off Baker Street. I was walking up past it yesterday because there was a tube strike, and he he was on a top floor flat, and his manager, Ken Pitt, gave him a room up there. And so suddenly he had access. I mean, an amazing space for him to be in. He could, one side, he could walk out and go towards Hyde Park, which is a really happening place. You can have the Stones concert there. His own song is going to be played for free in front of thousands of people there at one of their gigs. And then if you move east, you're into Soho. So this was great. But he was working and doing things. That was a move. But he was working and doing things before this. I mean, he had a job through his dad, really, but he had a job in the West End. But he kind of tucked it in, and he was into music right from the start. So Denmark Street was the place where he'd meet Elton John, where he'd meet, I mean, he met, thousands of people who incidentally were going to be regurgitated on his journey on from there. And he was gigging and out there with, from his first band onwards, the Conrad, from, pretty much the time that he left school. So we're talking in his progress, his physical progress, it actually belies his artistic and psychological and emotional progress, that he was already moving on from Bromley well before he actually left it. And his dad drove him over to Ken Pitt's house and in the little Fiat, and dropped him off there. And it must have been an extraordinary moment that he was suddenly free. But he'd been touring, with these bands. So he'd sort of broken away, but he had to get out of that space. And I think that he found it very difficult to transition. So Pitt, there's a famous example, Pitt arranged for a reception in Bond Street at Chappell's Music Store. There was a big opening, and Bowie was there to network and to glad hand. And he didn't do anything, like that. He just got drunk and tried to get off with people at this particular place. So Pitt was acting in loco parentis, and he took it very seriously. So I think Bowie found that thing of stability, of being responsible, very, very difficult. I mean, he was a pretty wild bloke, I think, with pluses and minuses. And he'd been on the road with his band, the Lower Third, and they were gigging in a converted ambulance where they'd had pretty much a hand-to-mouth existence, and they sleep in the back. So it was, he was out there doing all that. But that was a staging post, and an important one, because Pitt developed his artistic side. He took him to the Wallace Collection, which is just down the road. As I say, he took him to the theatre, and it was the kind of summer of '67. So it was hippies, Scott McKenzie. If you're going to San Francisco, be sure to wear flowers in your hair, which I can remember halting Top of the Pops when I was a kid. But Pitt did everything to promote it, and he was already kind of gigging in the Marquee Club, and he went to the theatre, as I said, and he took him. A pivotal thing that I've referred to was the stage version of Cabaret, and that was at the Cambridge Circus Palace Theatre there, 5th of April 1968, and it was that sort of thing, the contextual things that developed Bowie. So that was a staging point, and then he basically meets the love of his life, Hermione Farthingale, name she adopts, and he moves to Clareville Grove in South Ken, which is an extraordinary place. And again, he's sort of lodging up there, and a witness to that is John Hutchinson, guitarist from Scarborough, who's in there. So that's mid '68. So you can tell even before, way before he's made it, he's off and about. But he gravitates towards the West End and South Ken. I mean, it's pretty pucker place, and it's even more kind of moneyed now.
So describe what that setting would have been like, and how would he have fit in there?
I think it was fine then because it was kind of hippiesville, so he was just sharing a flat. But in the book, one of the things I try to do is negotiate how everything's changed, and that this is the real estate there is extraordinary. I mean, if you're not building a swimming pool below your property, or you haven't got 3 great SUVs, then you're missing out. But I think it was a kind of more naive and more wonderful sort of space at that time, and it was the people who knew him there just said he was very funny. There's a photographer who lived in one of the flats below, Vernon Dewhurst, who was going to do the photo that was going to become the cover for, when it was processed, the cover for Space Odyssey, as it was going to be renamed, that album. And he said that Bowie was just great fun and a mimic. He could do anybody, did a brilliant Dylan impersonation. And he said he just remembers this figure hanging over 12-string guitar. And that was Bowie's angle at that time. It was very much a kind of not folk music, but it was akin to that. It was that the kind of arts lab scene that he'd taken from Syd Barrett and Pink Floyd, the kind of psychedelia scene. He was going to then transport to Beckenham.
So tell for listeners who don't know what that was, explain that.
Okay, so when Pink Floyd started out, they had the most extraordinary sort of settings for their performances, and they started the idea of a show involving visuals, which could be great big sort of psychedelic bubbles being transposed over the performers and the stage, sound effects beyond the band, and a whole kind of hippie culture. But it was also based around drugs because it was based around LSD. So what Bowie did was to take some of those elements, and when he moved to Beckenham, his next port of call, where he briefly lodged with Mary Finnegan, whose brilliant book, Psychedelic Suburbia. We went to see her when we started doing these walks in April 2016. By we, I mean I was with a photographer, Christopher King, brilliant man. And she gave this talk in Zizi's, that had, which is a pizza place, that had been the 3 Tons public house, TUNS. And that was in the back room there. Bowie set up the equivalent, these arts labs. So all sorts of performances. You could have poetry, you could have people playing sitar. It was very alternative. It was really kind of alternative. As he said, he never knew so many people in Beckenham played sitar, which I thought was wonderful. And Beckenham, I'd recommend it to anybody listening in. Beckenham's a great place as a Bowie shrine. I mean, it really is I think it's a lovely place. So it's a leafy suburb. It's challenged by these youthful calls for artistic liberation. And indeed what Bowie did with Mary Finnegan, with whom he had an affair. But Mary Finnegan, I think, is an amazing woman, and she's still out there. And I think she had a profound influence on Bowie for the good. With her, and then with his new girlfriend, Angie Bowie, they put together with others the equivalent of a kind of Woodstock, a kind of open air festival in Beckrec off the Croydon Road, so this recreation ground. And it was centered around the bandstand. And maybe more on that later on. And it must have been an amazing affair. So that was August the 16th, 1969. And so he had all these really interesting bands like the Strawbs, Comus, Bowie himself. He was doing some of the comparing. An amazing event. And it was alternative. And that's reckoned in the song Memories of a Free Festival, which is quite wonderful, which I can see you nodding. I mean, but that was tinged in a way by the fact that Bowie's father had just died. So John, or Hayward Jones, I mean, Bowie really did adore his father. And I think you find it in that song, Memories of a Free Festival, because it starts with this strange little organ tune, and it's played by Bowie bought this Rosedale electric organ from Woolworths, a very childish thing to be playing, and it sounds almost as if it's it, it's in many ways the song is a eulogy, not only for the kind of lost heaven of the recreation ground and what's going on there. It was ragged and naive, it was heaven, but also I think it was something to do with the death of his father. So there we are. I digress, which is mostly what happens in the book, to be honest. Points of digression. So he was amazing. So he and others brought this scene to Beckenham, and the official name they gave to it was the Growth Arts Lab. And these events, they kind of transformed the Arts Lab area in ZZ's. And I went and looked there, just sussed out the space, and it was, again, it's just, as you were saying, it's so ordinary. And there'd be, people would come and sell goods that now were just a kind of an alternative to what I described, I think, somewhere as a suburban mock Tudor gentility, something like that, So you get Indian bedspreads, cushions, multimedia stuff, puppetry, workshops, that sort of thing. So in that way, he was well ahead on the alternative society stuff.
What was in the air at that time, apart from just a smell of pot everywhere? But because certain time periods seem to just be bursting with creativity, and then there are these long fallow periods. Like the 80s had a distinctive sound, the 60s, the 70s did. Now everything sounds the same, and there doesn't seem to have been this outburst of maybe that's just because I'm old, but I don't see that things coming together in the way that they did at this time that you're describing. It's like this festering creativity coming from everywhere.
Yeah, well, I think that's it. I think there was an openness, and at the end of the '60s, you had loads of things that were contributing to that. You had the moon landing, and yet counterpoint to that, you had a pointless war going on, a terrible war. You had Vietnam. You had in this country, you had a Labour government, which was perhaps, well, certainly more for the people. You had people discovering that they could go on holiday in Europe, that they could find themselves, and you had the end of repressive legal jurisdiction. So it was no longer elite. Well, you could be prosecuted for being gay. That sort of era, the early 70s, the turn of the 60s, beginning of the 70s, was a time of experimentation and of kind of themes and big projects. And I think visual explosions as well. So it was in the air with artists that you had abstract expressionism, you had Warhol becoming, but you suddenly have what was alternative being mainstreamed. And Bowie was really into that. And of course, he went to America and this was through Ken Pitt in many ways, because Ken Pitt, he looked after Dylan when Dylan arrived in the 60s and had met the Velvets and came back with the acetate of the first Velvet Underground album. And he'd said, I've got this young man in London who'd like to listen to this. And that transformed Bowie's sound. So he did a strange thing of kind of transporting America back in this fusion of sounds into British culture. And then, of course, from 73, 74, he's going to leave the UK and he was going to be part of the American culture. I think it's in those lyrics, actually. It was ragged and naive, it was heaven, which in itself is a kind of an allusion to Wordsworth. Bliss was it to be alive, to be young was very heaven, that kind of stuff. So I think there was the processes in the States and the UK, there was a sense of rebellion. And you had that with free festivals and working away from a kind of a massive countercultural movement that embraced so many artists. I mean, the Stones had a kind of psychedelic moment. The Beatles, obviously, Bowie, and then, but things that we were listening to, you were moving away from perhaps easily defined divisions in music, sort of R&B or mods or rockers or whatever, and you had lots of people being influenced by this sense that you had to have some other better kind of society.
So you mentioned Wordsworth a
Yeah,
moment ago. He comes up
yeah.
often in the book, probably second only to Bowie. So what role did Wordsworth play in your walks and the book?
Well, I was taught English by a Wordsworthian, a wonderful teacher called Kenneth Curtis. And I didn't realize what an amazing teacher he was, because he was a very modest man. But so he lived on Epsom Downs, and our school was in Ewell. And Epsom Downs is famous for the Derby, the great horse race. And I lived in Epsom, just between the two spaces. And I would often walk up to Epsom Downs. It doesn't sound much, and it wasn't much, and do these meandering walks. And Wordsworth was very interested in walking as a creative process, in that walking, and we now understand walking in a far more scientific way, walking provoking well-being, but also creativity, in that Wordsworth would compose whilst walking and then jot things down. I mean, it's not as simple as that, but as he puts it in the preface to the lyrical ballads, which he composed with Coleridge, and that was after meeting Samuel Taylor Coleridge, and very much a sort of a big walking relationship with Coleridge in the West Country, that poetry was the overflow of spontaneous overflow of powerful emotion recollected in tranquility. And what he's getting at, I think, is that Wordsworth was speaking about the I, like the I as the eye that sees, but also the first person single, which was singular, which was going to be the big thing of the Romantic movement, working away from universal truths towards individual emotions. And so Wordsworth, as a child, he's sort of there being haunted by his childhood experiences as he grows up in the Lake District. And his poem, the Prelude, this massive poem that was only published posthumously, is a record of what he puts the growth of a mind's growth. And it starts with all of these instances where this kid meets some terrifying experiences and beautiful experiences whilst he's out exploring. So I think that idea of poet as explorer, and also poetry and well-being, for me, came from Wordsworth's example. I mean, not all of it, but poems like Tintern Abbey and the Prelude are still very much there.
And you also mentioned walking with Ian Sinclair in the early pages of the book. Did he influence your approach to these walks?
Oh, very much so, yeah. I mean, I was really lucky. I was invited on a walk by one of the characters in the book, Kevin Jackson, who very sadly has subsequently died. And Kevin was involved with Ian Sinclair on a project that became the wonderful book London Orbital, which is about the M25. And so Sinclair, who is a genius, I mean, I don't know how he'll be regarded in 100 years' time, but he is the forerunner or forewalker of all or a lot of what I'm doing. So psychogeography, a term that's impossible to define, but is helpful and also perhaps unhelpful in equal measure, of walking and tracking the traces of where you're walking in relation to what is there and what had been there. So that's very much my angle of uncovering layers and patterns and markers. I mean, he's a master of doing that. So what he does with London Orbital is to unpack places, not in a straight and dull historical non-fiction approach, nor in a fictional way, but somewhere in between these these kind of junctures. So he's very interested in stories and lost stories, and also subversion, I think. And I was asked to go to Epsom and to walk around what were then the asylums that were set up by London County Council, the five great asylums, which was situated in Epsom. And because I'd grown up there, they were, in a kind of Wordsworthian sense, haunting and memorable. I mean, cycling past St Ebba's Hospital, where attitudes thankfully have moved on concerning mental health, where that was a children's hospital, or West Park or Horton. And these are places where people were incarcerated. The treatment involved chemical koshes, ECT. But I knew that terrain really well. And so I went with Sinclair, and I went with Ian and his friend, the artist Renchi Bicknell. And they were doing the walks all around the M25, but I joined in there and we tramped around. But I also knew he's obsessed by tunnels. I also knew the entrance to some tunnels that go under Epsom Downs, and these were built to house members of Parliament, the royal family, in times of crisis. And I knew exactly where the opening was because it was at the end of my road. But it's a kind of mysterious, literally subterranean sort of moment linked to the subconscious, of course, in the kind of history of a place like Epsom. So walking with Sinclair taught me many things, but one of the things was to notice things. So as simple as that, and to have a notebook and to keep every jotting, because it could be that something out there ties in with something within you, or something that's you're going to encounter somewhere else. And I think, a figure that Bowie met when Bowie was living in Oakley Street in Chelsea, when he'd made it, really. I mean, if you go there, it's the most extraordinary place, was William Burroughs. And Burroughs really did influence him. Burroughs has a long, and whether it's a happy influence or not, but Burroughs, as you know, he's the author of The Naked Lunch, Soft Machine, Junkie. He was the archetypal person you probably didn't want to meet. Mad, bad, dangerous to know. So that kind of the daddy of the Beat generation. He'd stand trial for murder. Was it a drunken William Tell stunt with his second wife in Mexico City? It's that kind of stuff. But he got off with manslaughter. He bumps into Bowie, and he teaches Bowie. He teaches him about writing and the kind of cut-up style that's going to really influence Bowie's work from Diamond Dogs onwards.
So describe that for listeners who don't know what cut-ups are.
Okay, so when Burroughs was writing, he was fascinated by sort of, deliberately subversing narratives. So you cut up, you place one writing act next to another, or you could have written a paragraph. I've tried it. It's really interesting. You can write something and then you get your scissors out. You intentionally disconnect one element from another and then repackage this, which Bowie did famously, I think, on songs like Sweet Thing on Diamond Dogs. But this is also part of Burroughs' belief in magic, with a capital M, probably a K at the end of it, in that he believed in coincidence. He said there was always some purpose behind every chance element. And I think it really ignited Bowie's creative processes and made him rethink what he was doing. And he used this technique, and then he deliberately wanted to get messy in his creative processes for decades after this. He'd resort to it or use versions of it. And indeed, when he worked with Brian Eno, Brian Eno had developed with, I'm just going to find them because they were on my desk,
Hmm.
my pack of oblique strategies.
Oh, you have them. Yeah,
Yeah, I've got them, and I will find them probably well beyond well beyond this interview. But this idea that you pick up a card that gives you an instruction, and you follow that instruction, or you go against it. You can choose to go against it. Pick up another card that's got a strange instruction. Go back, repeat. Life is full of holes. Kind of could be crazy stuff, seemingly, but this messiness is very much part of the creative process. And I think that comes into the Berlin element. And there's a great book by the writer Tim Harford, Messy, which is all about the kind of how essential disruptions, improv, enforced moves into unfamiliar territory are to creativity. And I think if you look at it that way, well, that's Bowie. That's what he did. I mean, he deliberately sort of put himself in situations where he was at risk or he had to try something new. And it didn't always work, but at least he was trying it. And that was, I think, one of the things that's wonderful about Hansa Studios. And indeed, in that book, in Tim Harford's book, he starts with the example of Eno collaborating with Bowie. And Bowie was a great collaborator. So he was very open. I mean, I think that was another thing that really helped him and that appealed to me in the walks and the methodology of the walks was that he was open to influences. So he would be, by repute, the person who would just chat with anybody, who would be incredibly friendly and positive in his meetings, who'd listen, and then, of course, take things from other people, whether it was artwork, whether it was a guitar riff. So Diamond Dogs, for example, he rips off the Stones. He doesn't rip them off. He turns it into something rather wonderful. And he rips off artwork because he meets an artist who'd been working for the Stones. And he said, "Oh, right, I fancy a bit of that. I think I'll have that as well." So he was kind of picking pockets almost, but in a kind of very influential artistic way. I think that there's nothing new with that. I mean, that's the modernist and postmodernist way of doing things, taking things and bringing your fragments together and putting them into something unified and whole.
So you mentioned Berlin there. It's the only non-British location in the book. So why did you feel you should include it?
That's a very good question. I think because I'd been there and it had such a significant, I mean, it had such an impact on me. There are many reasons for this. I went there early on in the process. So this was October 2016. And there was great political upheaval at the time. I mean, you had things happening in Europe and in the UK. You had the whole Brexit thing, which was, in my view, a total disaster. And I'd always celebrated Bowie as being, and I think Bowie celebrated himself as being European, as he sings. The European canon is here somewhere, station to station. And I'd always wanted to go to Berlin. I went there with Kevin Jackson, as I said, who's an amazing man, a polymath. He wrote on anything and everything. He was on the arts desk at the Indie. He's an old friend. And I went there with him and Chris King. We had a great time, but it taught me a lot. I wanted to include that chapter because it taught me that I had to really, to get Bowie, I had to start from home or closer to home. And that although I loved it being in Berlin, being completely lost, and we played the oblique strategies stuff, and we played all that. We played the Guy Debord and the defamiliarization, you don't know where you're going. And we did this for 3 days, and of course we were getting nowhere. So we applied some sense and logic. And we had actually been to Die Brücke, the wonderful gallery that houses. I mean, well, you're in Berlin, and
I go there often. Yeah,
I mean, it's just what an amazing space. And that houses the abstract expressionists that Bowie loved and that he sought to emulate. I mean, living in Berlin when he was in Hauptstrasse 155, he had this great picture of Iggy, an incredible thing. But it's in his bedroom, not much more. But this was part of a greater homage to Heckel and to Kirchner and to those great artists. And of course, the cover of Heroes is based on Heckel's painting of Kirchner posing in that way. So getting back to it, well, Berlin was just unmissable. As an experience, actually, I was looking, I've got a folder of all of the cuttings and lots of the other writings from it. I could probably write 100,000 words just on that trip. And I wanted it in there because it did go wrong. And I think it was the fourth day of the trip. And I thought, we've got to just do some of the basic stuff. We've got to go and get a feel for Berlin. So I got in touch with Thilo Schmid, who runs Berlin Music Tours. And he was hilariously funny.
There's some really funny dialogue in the book with him, yeah.
Yeah. He called me the first time I've been called many things in my life, rightly, I'm sure. But I rang him up and said, so they do these great tours. So anybody listening, do go on one of his tours, and he can tailor them. And they do a standard tour that involves Hansa Studios, where Bowie recorded Heroes, and Depeche Mode had been there, and everybody else. And I said, well, we didn't want this, and he said, you're a cunning capitalist, because I kind of bargained, cutting some of the price from this trip. So he just took us around Berlin in his car, which was magical. And it was absolutely magical. So he showed us the remnants of the wall, the Brezhnev kiss and all that stuff. But he was so funny. And so his touch was so light. But what he made me realize was this just wasn't my place. That bizarre as it may seem, it had to be in the book because it had to show that I wasn't there. I wasn't there, in terms of what I knew about Bowie, and I had to go back and start where he was born, where his parents first met in Tunbridge Wells, which is then the next chapter in the book, which was right next to where I was living and working. And indeed, the cinema that was where Bowie's parents met when Peggy was working. She was working as a waitress in the Ritz Cinema, this extraordinary building that was there in the middle of Tunbridge Wells, a kind of state-of-the-art thing with a 50-foot glass tower. She was there, and she meets this sales bloke from Bernardo's just after the war, and that's where Bowie's story starts. And her parents lived in Southborough, which is physically, it was about 2.5 miles from where I lived, up a great big hill, but there we are. And so I just felt I had to go to these places and to investigate the things that were absolutely on my doorstep. So it's a very good question about why it's in there. It's in there because it was just too good to leave out. What do you think?
Well, it would be hard not to talk about Berlin, I think, because it was such a departure in his work. Like you mentioned that bands like Kraftwerk and Tangerine Dream turned his attention away from American soul to kind of a European electronic instrumentation, and it's those albums are so strange. Those three Berlin, well, the two really, and part of the third.
Oh yeah, I love them. And when Low came out, I was a student and with a couple of fellow students. I remember buying it and thinking it was like something. It was, as with many of the things from Bowie, it was like something from another planet. The cover, a still from the set of The Man Who Fell to Earth, and everything about it. And it was completely different to stuff that he'd been producing 5 years before. So you listen to Aladdin Sane, and then you listen to that, and you think, wow. And that decade was and is for me the golden decade. I mean, pretty much everything worked. Lodger, I'm not sure about. I just think it's too, if you like, it's too willed as being spontaneous and different. Some of the songs and some of the soundscapes on it, but Low and Heroes, they're marvelous things, and they were, as you've just said. I mean, he did what Burroughs or Wordsworth would have wanted him to do. He took things and he transformed them. He took fragments, bits and pieces from his experience. And Wordsworth famously, the opening line of the prelude, fair seed time had my soul, fostered alike by beauty and by fear. I mean, there's something quite haunting and dangerous about the sounds in there. And then you've got Burroughs and that kind of scavenging and putting one thing, cutting things out and putting one line next to another. You get all of those elements. And then, as you say, the sound. And it's the synth sound on it that's so extraordinary. A plug for a great book, by the way, here, The Sound of Being Human by Jude Rogers, is a wonderful book where she charts her life via, I mean, there's a lot more to it. I learned a heck of a lot about how music affects us. She charts her life through particular tracks. So she can go from ABBA to REM to Nina Sherry. But track 6 is Radioactivity, Kraftwerk. And she talks about that experience of going to listen to Kraftwerk. I mean, it's just completely other. And yet, I'm on a roll here, so you'll have to cut this. And yet, Kraftwerk, they get Germany, don't they? They get that. I mean, somehow they get it. I remember listening to Kraftwerk and Tangerine Dream. I went to see them in Croydon. That was another thing. The music, you could have Tangerine Dream and you're listening to first and you think, wow. And I'm in Croydon. I'm in the Fairfield Halls. And the support band with them were this kind of really good R&B band. Brinsley Swartz, brilliant guitarist, played with Graham Parker. But when Tangerine Dream were on, it seemed like we'd moved up a gear. We'd moved off the planet. We were doing something. And so Bowie somehow manages, when he gets it right on those albums, he manages to incorporate those elements into something that represents Germany.
Well, no, I think that's right. The first time I came to Berlin was December, I think 2013, and I just played that on repeat every night, low, and the instrumentals really captured the feel of the city in the winter, the gloom and the gray, the constant rain and the darkness. It felt like what that sounded like.
Yeah, and I think in the book I talk about one of the inspirations for him was that ruined portico of the Anhalter Bahnhof. And it was just by chance that I'd arranged for us to stay. That's my friend Kevin Jackson. His nickname was Moose because he resembled a moose. He's a huge man who spoke a little bit like this. And we were booked in to the Ibis, Potsdamer Platz. And so we emerged on the S-Bahn. There it was, this massive sort of chunk of something else. And of course, that station was one of the 3 great stations of Europe at its time, the biggest station in Europe, and a kind of portal for not only Goebbels and the deportations, but also Hitler arriving back from conquering France. So no wonder it was of interest to Bowie.
And you're right around the corner from Hansa Studios there as well.
Yeah, exactly. So, and being foolish, we didn't realize how close we were to, now I've got to get this pronounced this right, Kothnerstrasse, is that right? Kothnerstrasse?
Yeah.
And we went in our perverse ideas of going across the city, kind of ignoring what we knew, or going along with the kind of where are we now lyrics, thinking we'll do it that way. And incidentally, we found another Schlungel. You'll know what I'm talking about. We found an alternative Schlungel to the Schlungel on that. So we do these mad journeys, and then at night, I think the second night we were there, we suddenly realised it was very foggy. So what? Well, let's just go out and find it. We were there, And there it was, Hansa Studios, and I've still got the pictures of the front of it. And actually, that was more thrilling and significant than, in a way, than going inside and having it all explained about this is, this is Studio 2, I believe. I always get them wrong, where Heroes was performed. And I was more interested in knowing what the conditions were like when Heroes was being laid down as a track. And of course, it was madness. The place was, the ceiling was falling down, and it was messy. So it wasn't this sanitized space, but it did have its own kind of reverb. It had its own sound, and that's on Heroes.
There's a guard tower just down the street from there too, or it used to be there.
Yeah.
If you're walking past Hansa back towards Potsdamer Platz, like the main street there, down that, if you continue across the road, it's a little dead end, and there was one of the last remaining guard towers, and the wall was there. I was just down there last weekend, and it was all walled off with construction barriers. So I don't know if they ripped it down. I hope not.
No, it was there when we were there, but we chose to ignore it, which was really stupid. But what struck us was that, the kind of soundscapes and landscapes of that great title song, We Kissed, and the kiss, and all of the backdrop to that. It doesn't matter who it was and what was happening. That had all been transformed into bland uniformity, and you really couldn't see anything out of the windows. But you had to imagine that you were looking across into East Berlin. You were looking across in the most extraordinary idea. And that was more important to me, of imagining what it was like, rather than having the tour where everything had been dusted and cleaned.
Now, so much has changed in that area, just unrecognizable now. But there are a couple places that do look the same. Like, he filmed Just a Gigolo in Berlin. Not a great film, but there's a cemetery where they shot one of the scenes. That was down the street from my previous flat over in Kreuzberg, and the Grimm brothers are buried there as well.
The other companion we had, Chris King, he sensibly wasn't staying where we were staying. So he had an Airbnb in Kreuzberg. And so he'd tell us about things, and he knew certainly as much, if not more, about Bowie and Bowie's films than I did. But Just as Gigolo was, I have tried to watch it, but it's one of those things where it is almost unwatchable. But you see, the link there is it was directed by David Hemmings, who appears fleetingly in Blow Up, that film, and who was given the task of directing the film footage of the Earl's Court gig that I saw in July 1978. Again, so bad apparently that it couldn't be used. But he went to my school. He went to Glyn Grammar School before he left at the age of 14 to join Benjamin Britten because he had an amazing voice, to perform in Turn of the Screw. So I kind of like that kind of resonance, that there's a spot of my old school in the even if it's mucked up and things don't work. There's a spot of my old school in those sort of projects. Last thing about that Bowie in Berlin and that Anhalterbahnhof, the portico, was that he was reputedly fascinated by the whole thing, and the reliefs, the sculptural reliefs on the top of it that are still there, Grunau, I believe, the replicas are there of day and night. He used as inspiration for Low, and that he was going to call the album Day and Night. So the first side is boppier, you've got some lyrics, you've got sound and vision, you've got that kind of stuff. And the second side is more night. So you've got those wonderful, longer, beautiful harmonies, and you've got rhythms, but you have traces of voices, but no voices. Anyway.
See, we didn't cross paths earlier when you were working on the book.
I know.
I could have connected you with Jerome Frusa as well, the son of Edgar. He lives here still, and he told me stories about Bowie coming to their flats and to visit his father, and of him playing with Duncan Bowie when they were kids. And
Well, there is a chance that next year we'll come back, or two of us will come back, and on the dates that we chose in October 2016, of course, it's 10 years on from Bowie's death at the beginning of next year, that we're going to do that. So what we'll do, we'll link up. We'd love to do that. But the bizarre thing has been how the book and reactions to the book, these things have led to a proliferation of links, of connections. So, for example, a friend of mine walks into a shop in Whitstable. Her name's Julie Flower. She's a very good writer, brilliant performer. She goes into this shop. She has a Bowie tote bag, Bowieland tote bag, because we gave her one. And she goes to her friend Sue, who runs the shop. Hey, you might be interested in this book. And Sue reveals a copy of the book from under the counter and said, yeah, I'm really fascinated. And then they have a chat about it. And she said, why are you fascinated? She said, well, I knew Bowie and Iggy when they were in Berlin, and I've got a lot of stories that I could recount, but she wouldn't do. She wouldn't do at that point. Or give a reading in Cambridge. Somebody's there. They go back to Norwich to talk to a friend, and that friend says, oh yeah, David Bowie. Yeah, my brother, he was the driver of the train that ran over Terry, his half brother, at Coulston. So it's had a kind of strange effect in that way.
That's interesting because it kind of echoes the book in that sense. Like
Yeah.
that's what I like most about it. I think the way that you layered in stories about the many writers and artists and musicians whose trail intersected with Bowie's in some way, because it gave me a new appreciation for the kind of the depth behind the lyrics and just the sheer amount of talent that came out of some of these rather dull sounding places. So in among these lost connections, what surprised you most?
That's an almost impossible question, but I'll try and answer it. I think what surprised me most was what I didn't know about what I thought I knew. Just going to places where I thought, oh, Croydon, I know all about Croydon. I grew up around there. I support the team that plays there. I went with my dad there. I did my driving lessons there. All that sort of stuff is going to these places and thinking, actually, I had no idea that the Greyhound where he played when Ziggy was just happening, when they were supported by Roxy Music, I had no idea that backed on to this bit of Surrey Street, and I had no idea about how that fronted out. I'd forgotten how it fronted out onto Fairfield Halls. So it's those kind of it's the local kind of tiny details, or forgetting, or doing the thing that you do when you think you know somewhere. You think you know a route, and then you walk it again, or you just walk back along that route, and you must have done that this so many times yourself, and you just get a completely fresh perspective. I suppose actually I think the things were meeting people who had astonishing stories about Bowie. So meeting the guy Darren Montag, this environmentalist, where Chris and I chanced upon this meeting. It was, via a photographer called Lenny Newman. We had a chat about photography, and then we got on to rock guitarists. And then on the other table, Darrow was there with his companion, and Darrow piped up and said, oh, I'm a photographer. We said, yeah, here's the project, Bowieland. He went, oh, yeah, that's right. Yeah, I stayed in Bowie's flat in Manchester Street. Wow, that's amazing. And we weren't going there, but we thought, right, we better get there. And said, yeah, I actually stayed in his room, and there was a cupboard. And we said, well, yeah, was there anything in there? He said, yeah, there were a pair of boots painted silver that he used for the first video of Space Oddity. And by this time, Chris and I, we have this. It's all kosher. I'm still in touch with Darren. We were going, you're joking? Yeah, we gawped at him like bemused owls, and he said, yeah. And we said, well, what happened? Well, have you still got the boots? He said, no, I think we chucked them out, actually. And he was there at the beginning of the 80s with Ken Pitt before Pitt died. I actually looked it up, and from what I can glean, they were auctioned. So they may have been thrown out, but I think they were auctioned. So that was an amazing one. And his companion was film producer Anna Campo, who'd done the Joe Strummer biopic The Future is Unwritten, and also one of her other projects was Girl with a Pearl Earring. So just by chance, sitting in Flat White, having a chat with a photographer who also incidentally knew Lawrence Myers, who bankrolled Hunky Dory, you get into all these extraordinary layers. I mean, I'm very interested in art. I'm fascinated by what Bowie achieves in sound in relation to art. And I suppose another one was just thinking about Bowie in relation to the pre-Raphaelites, to Millet. When I went on that walk to Tolworth, I knew about it anyway. That the Hogs Mill, the River Hogs Mill, runs down, and that's where Millet did his uh, pictures, all his drawings for the background for the death of Ophelia. So he did this in the early 1850s, and he'd set himself up in this little kind of mock studio so he'd get all the details right, which was ahead of its time, and it sort of was ahead of the Impressionists indeed. And then he got a model to lie down and to be Ophelia, and that all sounds, oh, that's tenuous. This was happening just next to Tolworth and the Toby Jug, where Bowie is taking on this persona of Ziggy. But actually, Bowie was fascinated by the whole Hamlet myth, and he performs the cracked actor stuff that he does in America. If you see that Yentov film,
Yeah.
there he is. He's doing Hamlet. He's performing to the skull, to Yorick's skull, and there are all these echoes of Gertrude's behaviour in Hamlet. And he knew he knew all these texts. And of course, then you link it to the album Lodger itself. We've just said it may not be the greatest album in my view, but then what do we have? We have all these supine images. Che Guevara's corpse, Mantegna's lamentation of Christ with that famous image with the body foreshortened, and a baby lying face up, hands there in glee. So you have this kind of fascination. You think, actually, I think something's happening there, even if I'm just even if I'm just overdoing it. Something's going on, and these connections. I think that's what the walks taught me. These connections, they are out there, and I've started redoing. I mean, I had to take a break, but they're out there. So if you go back on, if you trace these lines, they're fascinating. If you just connect what's there visually, it could be a strap line on an advert, or it could be what you know about a landscape or a river. And so these things do become quests, which is, that great Bowie idea, that K West sign on the cover of Ziggy. Sorry, I rambled there, but I hope that.
No, that's perfect. You led right into my last question. You said that the walks in the book were done over 8 years and counting, covering thousands of miles.
Yeah.
So have you continued after writing Bowieland?
Yeah.
Are there still places that you hope to find?
Well, most definitely. I think my wife, if she's listening to this, had better cover her ears, because and again, what happens when you write something is people, and I'm sure you've had this experience. People say, "What are you writing next?" And you think, "No, I need to recover from this and never think about writing again for about 6 months." I have got projects. I mean, there are certain walks that I think are just incredible. So when COVID came and we had lockdown, it was March 2020. I was just about to do a really long walk from Orpington, could not be a more mundane kind of sounding place, 6 Irvine Way. Oh my God, I got that right. Is it Irvine Way or Irvine Walk? I'm sure somebody, I think it's Irvine Way, will correct me. Which is where Bowie's saxophone teacher lived, Ronnie Ross. And Bowie used to go there when he was a kid, and he was obsessed by playing sax. And his first instrument, it was sax. He was always fascinated by the saxophone. And he went over there to learn how to play sax. And Ronnie Ross was pretty savage, actually. And charged him quite a lot and said, you got to improve. You've got to do this. You've got to do this. But also gave him this kind of idea that he was going to keep going. And I wanted to do that from Orpington to Trident Studios, which I know very well, in St Anne's Court in Soho, because Bowie did the most extraordinary thing. These lessons were taking place in 1962. 10 years later, I mean, it's impossible to think what Bowie had achieved. Bowie is producing Lou Reed for Transformer. I mean, wow. I mean, in itself, it's mind-boggling to think where he's come. And he invites Ronnie Ross back to play baritone sax, the sax at the end of Walk on the Wild Side. And it plays out that astonishing solo. He invites him back to Trident Studios. And apparently, I don't think I put this in the book, apparently when Ross got there, he didn't even recognize Bowie. He just didn't even, he thought, who is this guy? And he thought, oh my God, here he is. And of course, Bowie didn't become Bowie until September 1965. We're 8 days away from 60 years on of the transformation from David Robert Jones to David Bowie. So I wanted to start that walk and do this kind of crazy walk from Orpington all the way up into London. And I was scoping it out. And then 2 days later, we had lockdown. So I'm still going to do that. And if it's going to be a sort of Bowieland revisited, I'm very happy to do that. And lots of friends and a couple of people who were in the book said, can we just go and do a bit of this walk again? And so I've been around Beckenham and Brixton, and I want to go to Southend again, just to see what it's like, how it's changed. So even with Tolworth, with the Toby Jug, where I went, where it was a building site, where they were just about to put something down on the very spot where Bowie played then in 1972, the second gig in that tour. It's now building. It's a massive, massive block. So I probably will go back just to see what it's like.
Is that where you write about it as well?
Yeah, I would actually. I'd quite like to do, if I have if anybody's interested, to be honest. I think a kind of a Bowieland revisited would be interesting as a project in about 3 or 4 years. And I would definitely do Berlin again. And I'd probably, certainly not at the moment, I wouldn't go there. I'd probably go to the States. I probably wouldn't be allowed in the States, to be honest. I'd like to go there and investigate Bowie's New York. But I think that, again, as I've said, another thing would be just to go back and to retrace some of that tour that you get in that wonderful Yentov film, Cracked Actor. So I would do that, and to do West Coast America, to do him, the whole LA thing. So
that's great.
Yeah. So that could happen. That could happen.
Well, I look forward to that.
Well, I don't know.
Oh, fantastic. Well, thank you for your time today, Peter. You've given me new appreciation for the hidden depths behind Bowie's work, and I really hope that you continue these walks and that you continue to write about them.
That's very kind. I think the message is, for anybody listening, do your own walking and do your own pilgrimage, and it could be with somebody completely different. I don't know who it is, Brian Eno, for example. But get out there and trace their footsteps. Anyway, thank you very much, Ron. It's been a real pleasure.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Personal Landscapes. If you like the podcast, please give it a rating on iTunes and subscribe through your favorite app. You can find links to today's podcast and more conversations on Books About Place at ryanmurdoch.com. You'll also find a donate button if you'd like to contribute to the costs of the show. All donations are greatly appreciated.